Talks with Russia resume as Ukraine looks to diplomacy to end the deadly conflict. The EU pledges unequivocal support for Kyiv, with 3 leaders visiting the capital. Kyiv is under curfew again after multiple Russian attacks on the city. Moscow is claiming full control of Ukraine's southern Kherson region. And China has made it clear it will not be a party to the crisis in Ukraine. Beijing is looking to avoid the impact of US sanctions. The European Union has unveiled a 4th package of sanctions against the Kremlin. Investments in Russia's energy sector will be banned, along with imports of steel products as well as the export of luxury goods to Moscow. More oligarchs will also be added to the list of individuals subject to EU asset freezes. EU finance ministers are in Brussels assessing the impact of sanctions on their own economies. More on this, Giles Gibson joins us live from Riga in Latvia. Giles, the EU has gone the furthest with Russian sanctions. Could more be on the cards, or have they reached their limit?
Well, the EU is really trying to walk a fine line here because as part of this sanctions package, they're going to ban investments in Russian oil producers such as Rosneft. But we understand, according to EU sources, this is not public information yet, but we understand that EU countries, EU governments will still be able to buy oil from those Russian oil producers. Of course, previously we've heard from European leaders saying that they are going to, over the next few years, wean themselves off Russian fossil fuels in attempts to diversify their energy supply. And of course, with crude oil at around $100 per barrel, that is not going to happen overnight. It's a really similar story with some other sectors such as luxury goods and autos and cars, because we understand that some exports of luxury goods and cars will still be allowed into Russia despite these sanctions, but there will basically be a cap on the value of that car or on the value of those luxury goods. So once again, the EU trying to balance things, trying to punish Russia with these sanctions, but trying not to punish economies within their bloc, such as Italy and France and Germany, who are so reliant on those sectors.
Charles, in the last hour, Ukraine's president again saying he's frustrated that NATO will not impose a no-fly zone over his country. Because NATO defense ministers meeting tomorrow on the Ukraine crisis, what might be on the agenda then?
Well, they're calling this an extraordinary meeting, which I think reflects just how seriously these NATO defense ministers are taking the threat of the invasion from Russia. We, of course, understand that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, would want there to be some sort of a discussion on the agenda of a no-fly zone being established over Ukraine. But again and again in the last couple of weeks or so, we've heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, that is not a scenario that they are willing to consider. They're not willing to put NATO planes up into the skies of Ukraine and potentially bring them into clashes with Russian fighters. Also worth noting that Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is hosting Baltic and Nordic leaders in London today as well. The idea there, trying to send a message to Vladimir Putin not to go any further, not to spread this military aggression to other countries that border Russia. And actually, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has addressed that meeting, addressed those leaders, asking them to send him more weapons to help his forces to try to fight off this Russian invasion.
And thanks, Giles. Giles Gibson in Riga, Latvia. Now, for more on the situation in Ukraine, Dawn is speaking to Dr. Ben Nemeth. He's a lecturer at the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College, who joins us from London.
Thanks for joining us, Dr. Bentz. So the Prime Ministers of the Czech Republic, Poland and Slovenia, all NATO members, they're in Ukraine on this historic mission. But beyond the symbolism of unity that we're seeing, how is this extraordinary show of support going to resonate with Ukrainians who are fighting tooth and nail for their country 20 days now into this Russian attack?
Yes, as you mentioned, it's an extraordinary support. Basically, going to an active war zone, being a prime minister is very risky. So it's an absolutely extraordinary thing. And I think the Ukrainians need to feel that the international community is behind them, especially the Europeans. and European countries, NATO and EU countries are sending military aid and different support and also sanctioning Russia. But as you mentioned, we are in 20 days of the Russian attacks, so a boost of morale is absolutely needed. The Ukrainian armed forces have a high morale and they are willing to fight, but the civilian population is getting more and more exhausted. And I believe this extraordinary meeting between the three European EU prime ministers and Vladimir Zelensky will be a very, very positive implication for the population.
So let's talk about the type of support that Ukraine really needs, Dr. Nemeth, because every day that Russia has come in with these attacks, we've seen that they've made apparent violations of the laws of war, clearly striking non-military targets. We've seen attacks on civilian populations, strikes on medical facilities, as well as even a nuclear facility. NATO keeps saying a no-fly zone is not going to be imposed, despite President Zelensky's repeated request to close the skies. So should NATO members be taking more risk, perhaps, with its choices in light of Russia's combat operations?
So NATO members decide, of course, what kind of risk they want to take. And at the moment, they say that they don't want to take a risk, what a no-fly zone will create. The no-fly zone establishment, the no-fly zone by NATO will definitely create a situation where NATO fighter jets should shut down Russian fighter jets. And this situation could escalate quickly to a full-scale war, potentially involving nuclear weapons. And NATO countries do not want to take this risk. The NATO is primarily responsible to the security of their members, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But NATO countries and the EU and NATO as organizations are providing so much support to Ukraine, which is unprecedented. They are providing military aid. They are created a sanction package that we have never seen before. Basically, the main aim now is making sure that the Russian economy is not going to be able to sponsor the war effort in Ukraine. And it seems that these sanctions and different actions that these countries are taking are very, very effective. But again, I wouldn't expect that NATO countries would be involved directly militarily, which would, for instance, with a no-fly zone or any other way.
That's precisely what President Zelensky wants, though, isn't it? I mean, he's done his utmost, arguably, to encourage NATO to take this stronger military stand beyond the sanctions that you mentioned. Even if they are effective, what they really need is that military assistance, that the intelligence, perhaps more shared intelligence. There are concerns about a spillover. Tell us what your concerns are. Do you think that this will spill over into Europe?
At the moment, we don't see anything that would indicate that there is a great chance of a spillover. We could see yesterday that Russian missile attacks happened very close to NATO borders, but NATO and NATO officials responded very quickly and decisively and warned Russia that even if accidentally it would hit NATO territory, the whole NATO would respond very decisively. So I don't think so that there is a great chance for this right now. But what we seen in the 1990s, in the Yugoslav wars, that if a war starts to be prolonged, things might happen. For instance, accidentally Serbian and Croatian troops entered Hungarian territories and other neighbor countries, and also they flew into the territories of neighbor countries. That time, these countries were not part of NATO, so it might happen. We have the precedent for this from the 90s. It didn't escalate further, but now the situation is different because the whole NATO and EU is united against the Russian war. So if it spillovers, the escalation has a very high probability, and the escalation might, as I mentioned, involve a full-scale war between Russia and NATO. Russia and NATO both of them are aware of this, so they want to avoid this, because if the escalation cycle starts, it's very difficult to stop it.
Dr. Nemeth, thank you for joining us. Dr. Bence Nemeth, there, lecturer at the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College, London.
And live now to Singapore and XGen. He was in Kiev for several months as his wife is Ukrainian. He joins us tonight from the Polish city of Krakow. Mr. Shen, Poland taking the bulk of refugees from Ukraine, and you have been telling me you have been very busy working out the details of the kind of assistance offered to refugees. Give us a sense of that.
The situation right now is there are still a lot of terrified Ukrainians back in Ukraine, and they cannot decide on their next course of action, as in where should they go, how long should they prepare to go for, and things like that. And we kind of serve as a bridge, as in we try to find answers for their questions on which are the processing center whereby they can handle big bulk of people coming in and processing them and then letting them moving on quickly. Because as the mayors of both Warsaw and Krakow are saying, the city has pretty much reached the limits whereby it can handle them. So, like yesterday, we met this lady from Eastern region, Krakow. She has been traveling on a train for 4 days, and because of the right information, she could plan for it, she could prepare for it. So she was on a 6 days train ride all the way to Budapest. But at least she would not have to suffer so much during her journey.
Oh, thanks for that. XGen explaining the sort of assistance being offered in Poland to refugees from Ukraine. Thank you.